But we did make it. It is 2024. You did it. Look at the person next to you and say, good job. You did it. You made it. You may have been a rough year. And New Year's always gives us a chance to look back, to reflect on what has happened. The new year with some hope, some anticipation that things will get better, maybe. And so just, like, how was your 2023? For you, was there any major life changes? Maybe you got a new job. Maybe it was a time where you haven't had a job. Or maybe you have a job that you just don't like. So we have jobs, maybe relationship-wise. Maybe you got married in 2023. Maybe you got divorced in 2023. Maybe you suffered a heartbreak or a loss. But looking back over the past year, can you see God's faithfulness in your life? Can you see those moments, like when we're in the struggle, when we're in the hard times, it can be hard to see God's faithfulness. It can be hard to see God carrying us. But now standing at the dawn of a new year, looking back, can you see like, oh yeah, I can see where God got me through. I can see where God got me through to this year. It's easier looking back to see where God carried us. It reminds me of the old Footprints in the Sand poem. Who's familiar with the Footprints in the Sand poem? Most of us, I think. But the idea of the footprints in the sand is that there's a person having a conversation with God. They're looking back over the person's life, and there's two sets of footprints in the sand. But then, as the person looks back, they see that during the dark times, during the times where they were really struggling, there's only one set of footprints, and they get a little upset. And they come to God and God, what's the deal? How come when I needed you most, you weren't there? And God says, no, it was during those times that I carried you. And so as we come to the end of the year, looking back, I just want you to consider for a moment, to reflect, where did God carry you in 2023? Where was He there for you? In the Old Testament, the Israelites, they experienced 400 years of slavery. God delivers them out of Egypt, and they're on their way to the Promised Land. However, things didn't go as planned. They disobey God. They don't trust God. They complain, they grumble, and God has had enough of them and says, okay, no Promised Land for you. Your children will come into the Promised Land. And so they wander in the desert for 40 years. They come up to the edge of the Promised Land once again. It's a new generation, and God is trying to get them to not make the same mistakes as the previous generation. And what God says to them in Deuteronomy chapter 1, this is God speaking, then I said to you, do not be terrified, because they were terrified. They were going to an unknown place with the people who were technologically advanced. They were enemies. They had walled cities. And this is just a nomad group. They were far behind. So they're afraid. But God says, do not be terrified. Do not be afraid of them. The Lord your God, who is going before you, will fight for you, as He did in Egypt, before your very eyes, and in the wilderness. There you saw how the Lord your God carried you. As a father carries his son all the way, you went until you reached this place. So where did God carry them? God reminds them it was in the wilderness. It was in the dark times. It was when you didn't think you could make it. I carried you. And God is wanting to remind them of that. So how did God provide for you in this past year? How did He lead you? How did He protect? Today we're finishing up our series called Travel Light. Travel Light. We find it in life that we just get burdened down with all kinds of things. We've talked about bitterness, letting go of control, and today we're talking about letting go of the past. Letting go of the past as we move into the new year, which is easier said than done. I think, in general, I'm an optimistic person. I'm a morning person. Like when I get up in the morning, my feet hit the ground. Like I'm ready. Like I don't need coffee. I know. In fact, I have a song that my mom, so I'll take out a lot like my mom, used to play for me. Listen to just a bit of this song and see if it blesses you for a moment. Turn it up. Turn it up. Louder, louder. Anyone else ever heard this song? Wait, here it comes again. time. Good morning, good morning, good morning. Listen, some of you are like, shut that off. All right, that's good. Shut that off, Rick. Cancel that before I lose everybody. If you're not a morning person, you're like, oh, the inhumanity. Make it stop. So I'm like, it's a new day. I'm moving forward type of person. I'm not a person who likes to dwell in the past. But I'm coming to understand more and more how much our past impacts us. Like how much our experiences plays into our current reality. My wife, she has a book on her shelf called The Body Keeps the Score. The Body Keeps the Score. I've not read the book, full disclosure, but the premise of the book is that trauma is a fact of life and it reshapes your body and your brain. Like what you've experienced in the past, it actually reshapes your body and your brain. Your past shapes who you are, your experiences, your upbringing, your parents, your relationships, the people that have broken trust with you, friends that have moved away, moving to a new city. I went to 5 high schools in 2 different states in 3 years. 5 high schools, 3 years, 2 different states, 5 different cities. And at the time, I didn't think anything of it. But now looking back, I'm like, I wonder how that messed me up. Like, I was being the new kid, not fitting in, and a story comes to mind. No, I'm not going to share that story. But so, like, all these things, and you may have experienced. Maybe there's a coworker who you've been trying to work with, and for whatever reason, they just won't trust you. Like you've tried, you've never like gone back on your word, and you're like, man, what is their problem with me? And then you get to know a little bit of their story. Then you get to hear about the person who they trusted most betrayed them, or how a parent walked out on them, and they just don't trust people. And then you realize, oh, it's not about me at all. They have an issue with trust. And all of us have things like that from our past. Our past shapes our current realities. Our past, and this is a multicultural reality. Like I don't care where you're from, what country you grew up in, what socioeconomic status that you have lived in. All of us experience our past shaping us in some way. Our expectations, our ideas about money, how to resolve conflict, how you process grief. It just doesn't like magically. It's all based on your past experiences. It's based on your past experiences. If you've ever talked with a therapist or a counselor, where do they start? In the past. Now, I should say, I did not vet that statement with any therapists or counselors. I was talking from my own experience. When I've seen a therapist or counselor, like, tell me about yourself. Tell me about how you grew up. We have some therapists here, and I would just wonder, is Dr. Elizabeth, is the past something, like in the first couple sessions that talk about, or am I just making, it's okay to disagree with me. Okay, she gave me a thumbs up, all right. I try to do a better job before I just make statements. That's out of personal experience. The past, all that is to say, as we move into the new year, we're carrying all kinds of stuff with us. We are carrying, and you might have aspirations, right, of new year, new you. But the person that was staring back at you in the mirror this morning is the same person who was there at the end of 2023. You are the same person carrying all that baggage, and the body keeps the score. The body keeps the score. And I wonder, we're going to jump into our passage, our scripture passage in just a moment. Just trying to set up some background for it. But I wonder, are there songs for you that when you hear them take you to the past? Like maybe they take you to like your college years, or maybe there was an old flame that was like your song, and you hear it and you're like, oh, I don't want to listen to that song anymore. But we have these songs that are, they bring up some memories. And when my oldest son was a baby, when he was a newborn, I had a job, and the job required me to be on call. Anyone ever had a job where you had to be on call? In those situations, some of those jobs, when you're on call, when you get the call, it's good because it meant extra money. Like I'm going in, I'm on call, I'm getting some money. This was not that kind of job. that I had. It was, you get the same amount, you get to take the call. And I worked for a property management company that did short-term rentals, like vacationers. And so I knew if I got the call, I knew two things. Somebody was upset, and something was broken. And I was tasked with going, and this was at a time in my life when, like when it comes to building and fixing, like if on a scale of like 1 to 10, I'm probably about a 5 now, with the help of YouTube. You know what I'm saying? Like I can look, at the time, I guess, I'm trying to think how old I am. If there was YouTube, that's beside the point. Like I was like a 1 or 2. So every time that phone rang, it was this instant anxiety and stress. Like, oh, somebody's going to be yelling at me. I'm going to try to fix something and pretend like I know what I'm doing. And so that cell phone for me, that sound became a trigger for stress, a trigger. And even, I worked that job for a year. When the job was over, I heard someone else with that ringtone, automatic, for the longest time, that same drop of adrenaline, stress, it was terrible. It was terrible. And in our Bible text today, there is a sound that is a trigger for trauma. There is a sound that is a trigger for trauma. If you've been following Jesus for a few years, you're probably familiar with this story. If you're not, that's okay. But I want to maybe give just a little bit of a different take on it this morning. We're talking about the past and how God wants to help us let go of the past. Jesus, he has a group of 12 disciples, his inner circle. And these are the people who are going to lead the Jesus movement forward after Jesus ascends, after his death, resurrection, his ascension. So he's got these 12 who are like his prime followers, his disciples. But they didn't start out great. Like as you read the New Testament, as you read the gospel accounts, you're not thinking, oh, these guys are candidates for, like Ivy League. They were not that. In fact, Jesus, on multiple occasions, he gets upset with them. He's frustrated with them. At one point, he calls them faithless and perverse. Like, that's not something you want Jesus calling you. Faithless and perverse. And they're a little dense. Like they just don't get what Jesus is trying to teach. And this is one of the reasons that we can trust the gospel accounts. Like you can trust the truthfulness of the gospel accounts, because later these same people would write the gospel accounts. And if you're writing yourself into the story, or if you're the leader of this new fledgling movement, like you want to present yourself, like you come and stand before a crowd and you're talking like, who are you? Or read the gospel accounts. In the gospel account, I'm going to make myself somebody. I'm going to make myself sound important. But what we have is not that. The apostles, the 12 disciples, they just look bad. And so the only reason you would write that is if it actually happened. So this is one of the arguments for the truthfulness of the Gospels. But one of those incidents where they don't look good comes at the end of Jesus' life. It's the Last Supper. It's the night that he's going to be betrayed. The next day he's going to be crucified. And Jesus knows this is coming. He's gathered the disciples around. They're having a meal together. They're celebrating the Passover together. As Jesus is teaching, Peter speaks up. And Peter's the type of guy who's always speaking up. And he said, Jesus, no matter what happens, I'm following you to the grave. I'm all in. I got your back. And Jesus knows Peter better than Peter knows himself, which can be scary to think about. And Jesus sees through what Peter is saying. He's like, oh, Peter, not only are you not willing to die for me, you're going to deny me tonight 3 times that you even know me. And Peter responds like, no, Lord, even if everyone else abandons you, even if I have to die, I'm all in. I am all in. What happens? Peter denies Jesus 3 times. He denies Jesus 3 times. So Jesus, he's arrested, and Peter is following at a distance, seeing what's happening, what's going to happen to Jesus. There's a fire, and Peter's warming himself up at the fire, and there's a servant girl, possibly a slave. It's like, hey, aren't you with the Galilean? Aren't you with Jesus? And Peter's like, oh no, I'm not with Jesus. And this happens 3 times, and we have 4 accounts of the life of Jesus. We have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And each of them tell the story of Jesus, but they have different parts of the story that they tell. Sometimes they share information, or like they tell the same story. Sometimes it's just one gospel. So, for example, in the Gospel of Luke, it's the only one that tells the parable of the prodigal son, the wayward son who goes. Luke. Jesus turns water into wine. That's the Gospel of John. That's not in the other Gospels. And then you have some events that are in all 4 Gospel accounts. And I don't know if that makes them more important, but it certainly says something about those accounts. Like, this is important enough for every Gospel writer to include it. And do you know that the account of Peter denying Jesus is in every single Gospel account? And what's more is that the Gospel of Mark gives the most detailed account of Peter's denial, which tradition says that Mark, the Gospel of Mark, we believe that Peter influenced that Gospel. So Mark wasn't one of the disciples. We believe he was around, even in the garden, even the night of the betrayal, that Mark may have been there. But it seems like Mark got his information from Peter. And the most detailed account of the denial is in the Gospel of Mark, which I think tells us something about the after story of what happened. So here's what it says in Mark 14, verse 70. It says, after a little while, those standing near to Peter, and they're around the fire, like, surely you are one of them, for you are a Galilean. And he began to call down curses and swore to them, I don't know this man you're talking about. Peter is so adamant in his denial that he begins talking in a way that I think in Peter's mind it's like, hey, if I just begin to talk and curse them, and they'll know I wasn't with Jesus, because that's not what Jesus followers would. I don't know if that's what he's thinking, but that's what he does. He acts in such a way like, oh yeah, this guy could have been with Jesus. And then the next verse says, immediately the rooster crowed the 2nd time. Then Peter remembered the words Jesus had spoken to him before, the rooster crows twice, you will disown me 3 times. And he broke down and wept. He broke down and wept. This is vivid imagery of Peter's experience. He has just denied the Son of God. He's denied the one who has walked with Peter 3 years. He's denied the one who called Peter from being a fisherman to being a fisher of men. He's denied. How many miracles had Peter witnessed? At one point in the story, Jesus asked the disciples, who do you say that I am? And Peter says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus says, blessed are you, Peter, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you. But this comes from the Father. And so so Peter walked with Jesus, and here he is denying Jesus 3 times. It says he broke down and wept. Now consider the sound of the rooster. And this is glorified imagination. But the roosters crow regularly, daily, known for early in the morning. And I wonder if every time that Peter, after this event, when he heard the rooster crow, if it was a reminder of his greatest failure. Like, what did he hear when he heard the rooster crow? Was it his past coming back? Like, Peter, you denied Jesus. Like, you're worthless. He probably felt guilt, shame, regret. I can't believe I just did that. What if the other disciples found out what I did? What if I wish I could take it back? What I wouldn't give to change the past. And we've all felt that about something in our life, something we've done. I wish I could go back. I wish I could fix that. I wish I could make that better. And the past continues to speak to us. And what did Peter hear when he heard the rooster crow? Was it a trigger for trauma? And we don't know what he heard, but we can imagine. And I know what we hear. I know the whispers of the past that we hear that say, you're unforgivable. Like you've done too much. Remember the way that you treated your spouse. Remember the time the coworker found out about you were talking behind their back. And the past that continues to speak to us. You remember how your relationship with your daughter, your relationship with your mother, remember how you damaged that? Remember how you didn't do enough, how you hurt too many people? You're unforgivable. Or maybe the past is whispering to you, you're unlovable. You're unlovable. If people really knew the real me, they wouldn't love me. Or maybe the past says to you that you have no future. You're damaged goods. You could never have an intimate relationship with someone because of your past and what you've done. You could never. You have no future. If we aren't able to let go of the past, we can't take hold of the future God has for us. If we can't let go of the past, we can't take hold of the future that God has for us. And as we start the new year, I want to remind you that Jesus doesn't leave us in our past, that he doesn't think we're unforgivable, that he doesn't think we're unlovable. In fact, he pursues us. Jesus pursues us. And that we know that because of what happens to Peter next. Jesus pursues Peter after his failure. So in the timeline, Jesus is arrested. Peter denies Jesus. Jesus is crucified. Jesus is raised from the dead. Jesus then appears to Mary Magdalene first, on the first day of the week, Sunday morning. And then Jesus appears to the 12 disciples. And they're huddled together. They're scared. They're afraid. The door is locked. Jesus appears to them. One of the other disciples, Thomas, he's not there that day. And so when Thomas finds out, Thomas is like, I don't believe it. Unless I put my hand and the nail spots in his hands, I'm not going to believe. I'm not going to believe. A week later, Scripture says that Jesus shows up to Thomas. Again, the disciples are gathered, but Jesus talks directly to Thomas. Said, Thomas, see, put your hands here. And Thomas, it's like, my Lord and my God, falls on his knees and worships. So twice now, Jesus has appeared to all the disciples, and we have no mention that Jesus has spoken with Peter yet. So now some more time has gone by, and Peter, if you put yourself in Peter's shoes, I wonder what he's thinking. Like, am I in? Am I out? Like, is this denial? Has it been too much? Like, what is Jesus thinking about me? So after the resurrection, Peter one day he goes to some of the disciples and he says, "Hey guys, let's go fishing." That's what they knew how to do. So about half a dozen disciples, they go fishing, and they fish all night. They don't catch anything. They could have used my help. See what I'm talking about? That's me this summer. A nice stringer of fish, very tasty, very fresh, right out of the lake. That's a shameless plug of my fishing abilities. All right. They didn't catch anything. They had no fish on the stringer. Jesus comes up to the shore, and then they're close enough where he can yell out to them, but they don't recognize that it's him. And that's kind of after the resurrection, they were always kind of uncertain if it was Jesus or not, which is interesting about what Jesus looked like after his resurrection. That's a different topic. Jesus calls out to them, "Hey, you having any luck?" And they don't tell any fishing stories. They're like, "Nah, we've been out all night. Haven't caught anything." Jesus says, "Try the other side of the boat." They try the other side of the boat. The net is full of fish. They're like, "Oh, this must be Jesus on the shore." Scripture says that Peter, always the one to just dive right in, he dives right in. The water says he swims to the shore. He gets there. When he gets there, Jesus has a meal prepared. His fire is going. He's got some fish ready to eat. And so we have the Last Supper. This is the last breakfast. The disciples are there. When they're finished eating, Jesus has a conversation with Peter. And we don't have time to go into all the details. How many details do we have time for? All right, a couple details. We got time for a couple details. So they're having this conversation. Jesus looks at Peter and says, "Peter, do you love me?" Peter responds, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus says, "Feed my sheep." He says, "Feed my sheep." A second time, Jesus says, "Peter, do you love me?" Same thing. Peter says, "Yes, Lord, you know that I I love you. In fact, I'm saying Peter, but actually Jesus used Simon's full name, Simon, son of John, 3 times, which, when someone uses your full name, when Jesus uses your full name, you're probably in trouble. Probably. Simon, son of John, do you love me? And the text says that Peter at this point was hurt. That he was hurt at the repetition of questions. He's like, yes, Lord, you know all things. You know I love you. And it's in this passage when Jesus says, Peter, do you love me? The word for love, there's several different Greek words for the word for love. You have agapao and phileo. You're in church circles, sometimes we talk about agape, love, God's love. Phileo, you're familiar with. If you've heard of Philadelphia, is a city of what? Brotherly love. Phileo at the beginning is love. Adelphos, for the back part of Philadelphia, adelphos is the Greek word for brother. You put it together, love brother. But I heard a preacher talking one time about this passage, about the different Greek words when he says, do you love me, do you love me, do you love me? And what he said was that there was a progression of the Greek terms for love. And so that each time Jesus was asking, there was like a deeper kind of love. Like, do you love me? And it's like a superficial. Do you love me enough? Do you love me? And it was like this. Well, when I heard that I was like, oh, that's interesting. And I was also in seminary at the time, which means you don't believe anybody. You're going to look it up yourself. And so I did a bit of digging, and I found that he was well-intentioned, but he was way off. He was off. And I like bring that up in case as you're going through your Bible reading, your Bible study, you hear something similar about these different, as in this passage, about these, it's not so. They're just synonyms. In the first two, when Jesus says, do you love me? It's agape, phileo. So there's no progression there. Each time Peter responds, it's with phileo. So don't, if someone's trying to throw Greek words at you and feel like you don't, the point is, Jesus wants to know, Peter, do you love me? You can do all that without knowing any of the Greek. All right? It's a regular English translation. So he asks Simon, son of John, do you love me? And here's what it says in John 21, verse 17. It says, the third time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, do you love me? He said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. By asking Peter 3 times, he is acknowledging to Peter that he knows that he has denied him 3 times. And he is at the same time, he's restoring Peter. He's giving Peter a job to do. He's telling Peter, I'm not finished with you. I want you to feed my sheep. And it's a painful process for Peter. But Jesus is more concerned with lasting healing than short-term feelings. Jesus is more concerned with lasting healing than short-term feelings. And so Jesus, he has work for Peter to do. Peter's failure doesn't disqualify him for the future that God is calling him to. And Jesus restores him and says, feed my sheep. It's like Jesus saying, Peter, don't stay in the past. Yes, you denied me, but I'm not finished with you yet. I've got something for you to do. Don't let your past define you. And we're not talking about actual sheep. Jesus didn't have sheep. But at one point in his ministry, Jesus calls himself the Great Shepherd. And he says the Great Shepherd is willing to lay down his life for the sheep. And so Jesus is telling Peter, I want you to love my followers like I have loved them. To feed my sheep. To love them sacrificially is what Jesus is telling them. So Jesus doesn't rush over Peter's failure. He doesn't say, oh, it's all good. He leans in. He talks the 3 times, the 3 reminders of the denial. He shows mercy. And Jesus calls Peter to imitate him. And so Peter steps into that role and he becomes a leader in the early church. He's still got some issues. Read the book of Acts. He's not perfect. But he becomes a leader and he doesn't let the past define him. He might have been a coward. He might have lacked courage. He might have been faithless. But that's not what Jesus. See, Jesus pulls him out of the past and says, Peter, I've got something for you. I've got something for you to do. And his past no longer defines him. So Peter becomes a leader. He writes some letters to various churches. 2 of them make their way into the New Testament. So this very person who denies Jesus, here's a couple things that Peter would later write. And so put yourselves in Peter's shoes. Knowing how he has failed Jesus completely. Later he'll write, in his great mercy, he has given us new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. This is Peter. This isn't someone who hasn't experienced mercy or experienced grace. He steps right in. In his great mercy, he has given us new birth. I'm not defined by the past anymore. 1 Peter 4:8. Peter writes, above all, love each other deeply because love covers over a multitude of sins. Peter knew because a multitude of his sins had been covered by Christ. And here now is the power of cross. Let's go back to the rooster. You remember the rooster, beginning of the story? This is the trigger for trauma. I wonder if now, after that encounter with Jesus, what had been a trigger for trauma became a trigger for a testimony. Come on, somebody. Like, it was no longer a trigger for trauma, but a trigger for a testimony. Now Peter, he's testifying about what was hope. Like, he's looking back and saying, that moment, at my weakest moment, Christ came to me. He brought me out. And now he testifies about what Christ has done in his life. It's a trigger for a testimony. As we look back in our own life today, like, what are those hurts, those pains, those failures that we look back and say, God, how do you want to turn that for your glory? How do you want to use that in my life? How can I speak of that in a way that honors you? How can I let go of the past? And for Peter, he is able to let go of the past. And I didn't say forget. He never forgot the past. We don't forget the past. But it probably is Peter who told the other disciples what happened. Who told Mark, who writes the gospel, he said, Mark, you should include this story. Peter, are you sure? Like, you're leading this thing, and this is going to make you look bad. Peter's like, yeah, but it's going to make Jesus look good. It's going to make Jesus look good. So instead of looking back at him, seeing himself as unlovable and unforgivable, now he sees himself as chosen and holy. One more thing I'll share with you that Peter wrote. So he's writing to a church, and this is of the people of God, but it also applies individually, and it applies to Peter himself. So he writes in 1 Peter 2:9, but you are a chosen people. You are a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out. He called you out of the darkness. He called you out of the past into his wonderful life. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. I don't know if, as Peter writes, like, if tears are flowing down his face, just, oh, God's mercy. God's mercy. Oh, I'm chosen. I'm a royal priesthood. I'm holy. I'm God's special possession. Christ has done this for me. As we begin the new year, I want to invite you to take a moment and reflect if there's anything that you are carrying with you into the new year. Anything that you need to surrender. I'm going to ask our worship team would come back. And I would say that what Jesus did for Peter, he wants to do for you. He's willing to do for you. He is pursuing you. Even you being here today, I don't know what brought you here today, if you're normally part of the Hills Church, or if you're a guest with us today. But you being here, I want you to know that Christ is coming to you. Beginning of this year, to say you don't have to hold on to the past. You can step into 2024 and look to the future and know that God is not finished with you yet.